Hello, good afternoon to you. Welcome to the marketplace. We're still celebrating 25 years of joy. My name is Aboagye-Wiafe, and in today's edition, prices of some farm produce in Kumasi go down significantly on day one of the partial lockdown by government. We'll be telling you more about this shortly. And also coming up, Association of Ghana Industries AGI welcomes recent steps by government to stop further spread of the novel coronavirus in the country. And immigration officials at Aflao returned some 7 individuals from Nigeria, Benin and Togo attempting to use illegal entry points to enter Ghana. We'll bring you details of all these stories plus more in this edition of the Marketplace. Don't go away. Welcome back to the marketplace, and we need to go to Parliament now, where Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta is expected to tell Parliament for approval for government's coronavirus program.
Lockdown or quarantine, and this will weigh heavily on economic activity in each and every country, with or without high rates of infection. There is an imminent threat of a global recession arising from the coronavirus pandemic, the extent of which is yet to be determined, but to what extent may be dependent on the measures we take today. Mr. Speaker, in the case of Ghana, even though experts agree we are yet to reach our peak, preliminary analysis of the macro-fiscal impact of the pandemic shows that there is likely to be a significant slowdown in our GDP growth, significant shortfalls in petroleum revenues, shortfalls in import duties, shortfalls in other tax revenues, increased health expenditure, and tighter financing conditions with consequences on the 2020 budget. The 2 main areas driving the bulk of economic activities in Ghana, namely the Greater Accra and Greater Kumasi areas, are also the very places mainly hit by the virus. From this dawn, these 2 centers of economic activity have been on a partial lockdown and will remain so for the next 2 weeks. Mr. Speaker, never before in the history of the Fourth Republic had the entire Ghanaian economy and society experienced such severe external shock by a single imported situation such as this. Certainly never before since independence has the Ghanaian economy faced such a sudden, dramatic, all-round reduction in widespread consumer and corporate demand as a result of a single health crisis. The situation is not homemade, but as the President said in one of his addresses to the nation, since the coronavirus outbreak, our survival is in our hands. Mr. Speaker, its impact affects every Ghanaian, either directly or indirectly, from the toddler who cannot attend nursery to the grandmother who is compelled to stay away from her own close family members, from the employer who sees demand dropping dramatically to the employee whose job and income are at risk. From big companies drilling our oil offshore to the farmer planting corn in the Afram plains and the street hawker selling finished products on the streets of our big cities. The self-employed, especially the hairdresser, the barber, the carpenter, the trader, the builder, the dressmaker, the musician, the trotro taxi driver, the kayaye are all already feeling the pinch from this global pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the virus does not discriminate. It is attacking big and small businesses. Big and small they may be, and they'll be convalescing for, I believe, another 2 years unless our interventions are bold. COVID-19 is particularly damaging to SMEs because most of these businesses rely on social interactions like hotels, restaurants, drinking bars, more retail shops, hairdressers, barbers, builders, musicians, taxi drivers, kayaye, and street hawkers. Mr. Speaker, President Akufo-Addo has introduced various measures to contain the coronavirus. The Bank of Ghana has announced a number of measures, including a 150 basis points drop in the policy rate to 14%, a reduction in the required reserve requirement from 10% to 8% to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. I'm here today to update the House on the potential economic impact of the virus on the economy and the measures government is taking to mitigate the impact. Mr. Speaker, the update will focus on A, potential impact of COVID-19 on the global economy, potential impact on the economy of Ghana, fiscal impact of COVID-19 on the 2020 budget, and measures being taken, in some cases being proposed, to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on households, businesses, and government. Mr. Speaker, international research institutions and multilateral organizations, including the Fund, the World Bank, UNECA, the Economic Intelligence Unit, and Fish Solutions, are all projecting significant slowdown of global GDP growth, with most predicting a recession or a severe economic contraction. Though the IMF had indicated earlier in March 2020 that the impact of the COVID-19 on global growth is difficult to predict, the IMF is certain that 2020 growth will slow down significantly from the projected 3.3% to maybe even negative growth. The UNECA predicts that the Africa 2020 projected GDP growth will drop by 1.4 percentage points from 3.2% to 1.8% as a result of the virus. The World Bank estimates that a 1% decline in developing country growth rates traps an additional million people into poverty. Mr. Speaker, given that mainland China is a major economy, a manufacturing hub, and a major supplier to the global economy, the COVID-19 outbreak in China has posed a major destabilizing threat to the global economy. China is the world's second largest economy and a leading trading nation. China today is significantly larger, 17% of global GDP and nearly 30% of global GDP growth, compared to 2003, when it was just 4% of global GDP. And it plays a major role in global supply chain and trade. Mr. Speaker, this pandemic is impacting the global economy through at least the following channels: disruptions in global supply chains of drops in value creation and delays in shipments of major goods and services, widespread supply shortages, including food, pharmaceuticals, and manufactured goods, and attendant huge price increases, slowdown in investments and mass layoff of workers, further dampening economic activity, unprecedented volatility and collapse of stock markets, which are already recording all-time low indices, tighter global financing conditions, despite interventions through monetary policy to cut interest rates, decline in the international price of crude oil, with significant revenue loss to oil exporting countries, decline in tourism resulting from border closures, fewer international trips, cancellation of cruise lines, airline suspensions, and cancellation of regional and global events, decline in remittances, significant job losses for businesses big and small, unanticipated increases in health spending, and higher public debt burden. Mr. Speaker, the global response to the pandemic has been swift, with a mixture of monetary and fiscal policy responses. Central banks have cut interest rates, making more funds available to both public sectors, whilst finance ministries are providing fiscal stimulus packages to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic. Multilateral institutions are also providing support through rapid disbursement instruments. Mr. Speaker, the World Bank on 3rd March 2020 launched a $12 billion fast-track facility to support low-income countries' preparedness and for the strengthening of health systems and emergency capacity to the COVID-19 in low-income countries. This amount has since been increased to $14 billion US. The IMF also announced on 4th March 2020 a $50 billion support to help address the virus. $10 billion of this amount is to be accessed by low-income countries through the Rapid Credit Facility. Mr. Speaker, I will now present the potential impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy of Ghana. Mr. Speaker, before that, I'll provide the House an update on the COVID-19 statistics in Ghana as of today, Monday, 30th March 2020. Number of cases, 152. Number of deaths, 5. Number of recovered cases, 2. Number of active cases, 145. Total number of deaths per 1 million population, 0.2. Mr. Speaker, the President outlined the 5 key objectives government seeks to achieve in the fight against the pandemic. And in that sense to deepen our self-reliance at the end of the day for the country. The President has accordingly announced a number of measures to control the spread of the disease in Ghana. These measures include partial lockdowns in the Accra, Temakasua, and Kumasi metropolitan areas, closure of borders by land, sea, and air to passenger traffic, prohibition of mass gatherings, closure of schools, suspension of counselor services, increased public education on the need for improved hygiene and social distancing. The socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 on the economy of Ghana is by direct and indirect routes, directly through the effects of the disease on production, trade, and investment within Ghana and between Ghana and the rest of the world, especially China, Europe, and the United States, on global commodity prices, crude oil, gold, and cocoa, on tourist flows, on fiscal stance, and on human life, especially the health and life of the most vulnerable. And indirectly through the slowing of global economic growth, supply chain disruptions, and by extension, the negative impact on Ghana's own growth. Mr. Speaker, after successfully completing a 4-year IMF program in April 2019 and implementing since 2017 a well-thought-out homegrown program by abolishing nuisance taxes and enhancing production, enrolling a number of interventions such as the senior high school program, Planting for Food program, the 1D1F program, and the financial sector restructuring program. Thereafter, Ghana returned to a path of sustainable economic growth with economic indicators returning to a positive trajectory. If not contained, both globally and domestically, the COVID-19 could have a devastating impact on Ghana's economy despite the gains made these last 3 years. Mr. Speaker, permit me to elaborate on some of the main potential impacts of the virus on the economy of Ghana. Impact on the hospitality industry. Both domestic and international are also reducing as a result of the pandemic. We are already seeing significant reductions in trade volumes and values of many countries, especially China, which constitutes the highest of Ghana's imports and the second highest of Ghana's exports. We are also observing reduced arrival of containers at the ports by at least a third, resulting in reduction in import duties. Reductions in imported intermediate goods could significantly slow down manufacturing activities in Ghana. Reductions in imports of goods and services is, however, expected to reduce the demand for forex for importation of goods and services. This has a favorable impact on foreign exchange volatility, enhancing local production of goods and services. Impact on agriculture. Mr. Speaker, though the impact on agriculture may not be severe, since agriculture does not require significant imported intermediate goods, growth could still be a slowdown as a result of disruptions in the supply chain and lower demand activities. Disruptions could limit farmers' access to inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, and insecticides. Uncertainty and fear could negatively impact planting decisions, and also a reduction in the volume of main agricultural exports as a result of the general downturn in global economic activity due to the pandemic. General shortage in food supply is anticipated if the pandemic intensified. This could lead to inflation in food prices, especially rice, bread, poultry, and other meat products, vegetables, sugar, and other commodities. Mr. Speaker, the picture is grim. However, as the President has stressed, the COVID-19 pandemic presents an opportunity to boost domestic production and consumption of some food commodities such as rice, maize, cassava, yam, and chicken. The plan is for Ghana to use the opportunity to increase the production and export of commodities for which the country has comparative advantage in to trade within the West African region among countries that have not closed their borders or cargo. Impact on commodity prices. Mr. Speaker, since the outbreak of the virus, we have observed a significant decline in the international price of crude oil as a result of a fall in demand, especially China. Crude oil declined from US $63.21 a barrel in November 2019 to $22.9 per barrel as of 30th March 2020. The sharp decline in crude oil price will result in significant shortfalls in petroleum revenue for the 2020 fiscal year. Consumers of petroleum products across Ghana are, however, likely to benefit from the decline in international price of crude oil, as the export price of petroleum is likely to reduce. The increased demand for gold as a safe haven as a result of the virus outbreak will likely impact positively on the balance of payments and receipts from mineral royalties. Gold prices have increased from $1,479 per ounce in December 2019 to $1,621 per ounce, an increase of 9.6% as of 30th March 2020. We have also seen a decline in cocoa prices from $2,440 per metric ton in December 2019 to $2,253 metric tons as of 30th March 2020. Mr. Speaker, the slump in import volumes and values will likely reduce the demand for forex for such imports, which may have favorable impact on foreign exchange volatility. On the other hand, reduction in exports from Ghana and investor capital flight could adversely affect the exchange rate volatility. The jury is still out as to whether all these will result in a net gain for Ghana. Impact on the financial sector and financing conditions. Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has led to tight conditions both in the global and domestic financial markets. The slowdown in economic activities is likely to result in debt service difficulties, especially from the sectors that are hard hit, such as aviation and hospitality. And containment measures such as social distancing may lead to reduced productivity and job losses. COVID-19 has also sparked off capital flight as a result of related bearish emerging market sentiments, and given the high proportion, about 25%, of local bonds held by non-resident investors. We are seeing an increase in demand for dollars, which could impact negatively on foreign reserves. Ghana's successful and timely raising of $3 billion from the Eurobond market in early February this year has been extremely, may I say, divinely helpful, and provided us with the needed buffer to anchor the cedi. However, in these apocalyptic times, we must do all we can to conserve and preserve our foreign exchange reserves. Impact on GDP growth. Mr. Speaker, real GDP growth rate could decline, Mr. Speaker, from 6.8% to 2.6% with infection and cases, and 1.5% with a partial lockdown. Mr. Speaker, the projected growth will further worsen in the event of a full lockdown. Mr. Speaker, I will now provide an update to honorable members and the people of Ghana on the potential fiscal impact of the pandemic on the 2020 budget. Even though events are still unfolding, preliminary analysis undertaken at the Ministry of Finance shows that the pandemic will result in significant shortfalls in petroleum receipts, shortfalls in import duties, shortfalls in other taxes, increased health-related expenditures, and tight financing conditions. Mr. Speaker, these will negatively impact the fiscal stance for 2020. Shortfalls in petroleum receipts. Mr. Speaker, government programmed a crude oil price of 62.6 per barrel for the 2020 budget, consistent with the PRMA Act 815. Global crude oil price has, however, declined significantly since the outbreak of the virus. As of 30th March 2020, as I mentioned, Brent was down to $22.9 per barrel from the December 2019 price of $65.9 per barrel. Preliminary analysis shows that an average crude oil price of $30 per barrel for the year 2020, being optimistic, government will register a shortfall in crude oil receipts amounting to $5,679,000,000 Ghana cedis. Mr. Speaker, the corresponding projected shortfall in annual budget funding amount, ABFA, is $3,526,000,000 cedis, while shortfalls in the Ghana Stabilization Fund and the Ghana Heritage Fund are $1,058,000,000 cedis and $453,000,000 cedis respectively. Projected shortfalls in transfers to GMPC will be $642 million. Ghana cedis. Shortfalls in tax revenue. Mr. Speaker, the anticipated decline in import volumes and values, as well as a slowdown in economic activities, will lead to shortfalls in both import duties and other tax revenues. Based on the performance of import duties to date, as well as assumptions on projected decline in import volumes and values, preliminary analysis shows that import duties will fall short of target by 808 million Ghana cedis for the 2020 fiscal year. Similarly, the projected slowdown in non-oil GDP as a result of the coronavirus pandemic is expected to result in shortfalls in tax revenues, excluding oil tax revenue and import duties, amounting to 1,446 million Ghana cedis, bringing the total estimated shortfall in non-oil tax revenue to 2,254 million Ghana cedis. Increased health expenditure. Cost of Preparedness and Response Plan. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Finance has been working with the Ministry of Health to cost the National Preparedness and Response Plan prepared by the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Health, and the World Bank. The Preparedness Plan seeks to, among others, enable early detection and effectively manage and contain a COVID-19 outbreak in Ghana. The initial cost of the programs and activities under the COVID-19 Preparedness and Resource Plan is about 572 million Ghana cedis. Mr. Speaker, more specifically, the plan seeks to strengthen coordination of the overall preparedness activities, strengthen capacity of regions, priority health facilities, and points of entry to prevent, rapidly detect, investigate, and contain the COVID-19 outbreak in Ghana, to strengthen the national capacity for lab surveillance and diagnosis, build capacity for early diagnosis, case management, contact tracing, and infection prevention and control, ensure minimum health logistics are in place in prioritized regions, health facilities, and points of entry for preparedness and laboratory capacity, sustained for timely and quality testing of COVID-19 samples, and increase public awareness on COVID-19 risk mitigation and response measures. Mr. Speaker, as announced by President Akufo-Addo on March 11, 2020, during his first broadcast on the pandemic, government has earmarked the equivalent 572 million Ghana cedis, $100 million, for the fight against COVID-19. Contrary to views of some skeptics that the money is not available, I wish to assure you that the money has been secured and is available to be dispersed in accordance with our public financial management procedure and rules. Indeed, from day one, government has not stopped spending in the fight against COVID-19. Coronavirus Alleviation Program. Mr. Speaker, the President's instruction to his economic management team is clear: how to reduce the accumulation of economic scar tissues from this disease. The President is determined to cushion the economic and social difficulties this virus is visiting on Ghanaian businesses and our people. Our task, therefore, is to minimize the huge threat of job losses and the impact of job losses. The President and his team are thinking outside the box to ensure that the principles of fiscal discipline are not jettisoned, and yet still ensuring that people have money to spend. Our plan is to ensure that essential public investments are not mightily compromised, while at the same time enabling significant increase in spending on health. Beyond that, government is committed to using this unprecedented challenge to our economy and society as rather an opportunity to fast-track even more our agenda to industrialize, become self-reliant, and to move Ghana beyond aid. Mr. Speaker, that is why, to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus on business and households and ensure that economic activities are sustained while minimizing job losses, the President on Friday, March 27, 2020, announced the establishment of the Coronavirus Alleviation Program, the CAP. The Ministry of Finance will immediately release an amount of 1 billion Ghana cedis upon approval by Parliament. The Ministry is proposing to use the equivalent of US $290 million from the Stabilization Fund for this. The CAP will focus on areas that will provide maximum results in alleviating the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, with a focus on protecting against job losses, protecting livelihoods, supporting small businesses, and ensuring the program is efficiently and sustainably implemented. The CAP will seek additional funding for the following purposes: promotion of selected industries to shore up production for export and import substitution, to support SMEs and create jobs, to partner with pension funds and insurance funds, to create guarantees and first loss instruments to promote business. Mr. Speaker, my duty as Finance Minister is to begin speedily and responsibly the process of disbursing the funds immediately the amount is approved by this House. Targeted businesses and households would include those in the health sector, education sector, hospitality industry, SMEs, and households hit hard by the coronavirus. The specific details of the CAP and the instruments to allocate the resources will be fashioned out shortly. Mr. Speaker, the total estimated fiscal impact of the shortfall in petroleum receipts, shortfall in import duties, shortfall in other tax revenues, the cost of the preparedness, and the cost of the coronavirus alleviation program is 9,505,000,000 Ghana cedis, 2.5% of the revised GDP. Mr. Speaker, a recalibration of the 2020 fiscal framework underpinning the approved 2020 budget to reflect the fiscal impact of the coronavirus as outlined above, without incorporating measures, shows that the overall fiscal deficit will increase from the programmed Ghana 18.9 billion, 4.7% of GDP, to 30.2 billion, 7.8% of revised GDP. The primary balance will correspondingly worsen from a surplus of 2.811 billion, 0.7% of GDP, to a deficit of 5.6 billion, minus 1.4% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, measures are therefore required to close a fiscal gap of 11.4 billion, 2.9% of revised GDP. Mr. Speaker, as the President reminded us last Friday night, we know how to bring the economy back to life. Every Ghanaian knows this from our performance over the last 3 years. But what we do not know is how to bring people back to life. We shall therefore spare every sinew to support our household and revitalize our industries and services. The Ministry, Mr. Speaker, has moved very quickly to engage our development partners to very good effect. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'll now update the House on measures government is proposing to close the fiscal gap. Since we are faced with extraordinary circumstances which require extraordinary measures, we would like to propose the following measures for the consideration and support of the House. A, lower the cap on the Ghana Stabilization Fund from the current $300 million to $100 million in accordance with Section 23, Clause 3 of the Petroleum Revenue Management Act. This measure would enable the excess amount in the GSF account over the $100 million cap to be transferred into the contingency fund consistent with Section 23, Clause 4 of the PRMA. The amount transferred in the contingency fund will be used to fund the coronavirus alleviation program, CAP. Through this process, an estimated 1.25 billion Ghana cedis will be transferred into the contingency fund to fund the CAP. Mr. Speaker, we therefore wish to seek approval from this August House for the Finance Minister to use the funds which will be available in the contingency fund to fund the coronavirus alleviation program. B, arrange with Bank of Ghana to defer interest payments on non-marketable instruments estimated at 1.2 billion Ghana cedis to 2022 and beyond. Adjust expenditures on goods and services and CAPEX downwards by 1.248 billion. Secure the World Bank DPO of 1.716 million Ghana cedis. Secure the IMF credit facility of Ghana cedis 3.145 billion. Reduce the proportion of net carried and participating interest due GMPC from 30% to 15%. Amend the PRMA to allow a withdrawal from the Ghana Heritage Fund to undertake emergency expenditures in periods of national emergency. We would like to consider it in its own time. Mr. Speaker, reflecting the above fiscal measures in the fiscal framework, not including the Heritage Fund, the results in a fiscal deficit of 6.6% of revised GDP. The corresponding primary balance is a deficit of 1.1% of rebased GDP. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that even after reflecting the proposed measures, the resulting fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP is in excess of the 5% threshold stipulated by the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2018, Act 982. In addition, the primary balance is a deficit equivalent to 1.1% of GDP, contrary to the positive balance prescribed by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The extraordinary circumstances posed by the novel coronavirus pandemic, a health epidemic, with significant impact on the macro-fiscal operations of government, certainly has implications on the fiscal rules as outlined in the Fiscal Responsibility Law. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to monitor the fiscal situation and take responsible and appropriate decisions in due course. Mr. Speaker, following consultations by the Minister for Finance with key stakeholders in discussions with Cabinet and the directives of His Excellency the President, the following additional measures are being pursued to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. His Excellency the President has established a COVID-19 fund to be managed by an independent board of trustees chaired by former Chief Justice Sophia Akufo to receive contributions and donations from the public to support the CAP and to assist in the welfare of the needy and the vulnerable. A realignment of city funds towards expenditures that need to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus pandemic, sanitation and health-related expenditures especially, and limit the award of new contracts whilst focusing on the payment of arrears. Amendment of the Ghana Act to allow government to borrow beyond the 5%. To borrow beyond the 5%. The COVID-19 menace, as echoed by His Excellency the President, let us all practice the official preventive measures that have been outlined by professionals, including social distancing of 1 meter,
The Finance Minister's address to Parliament seeking approval to some curtailing measures to the impact of the coronavirus on the economy.